Thanks very much, Jim, for that kind introduction. I only have about 15 minutes, and I feel like with all of the different things I've heard in the last 2 days, I could speak for about 6 hours just taking up the different threads that came up. I've got a list on my phone in case I run out steam on the first one, but I suspect that I won't. I suspect I'll go for 15 minutes on the first one, which was a phrase on the bus tour on the first day, just after we'd seen all those walls. The question, I think it was Barry, may have been Alan, I'm not sure who asked, are we settling for separation in this city? And that phrase really stuck with me, and it's the one I want to focus on because in the end I'll get to the theme of the session, extremism, because I think it's a path which starts there and ends, or can end with extremism. The thing that struck me about the tour of Belfast was how, as we've heard repeated, there are far more walls now than there were at the beginning of the peace process, and it seems as if, in the short term, these walls have had a measurably positive effect in reducing the amount of violence. And so there are all kinds of actors who are happy to see that, including the people living in these areas. But we're all gathered here and we're all very uneasy that this is not a long-term solution. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the phrase, making the best the enemy of the good, which is a kind of realist, pragmatist slogan. But I think we're faced with a situation which is the opposite, which is the risk of making the good the enemy of the best here, and that things which work in the short term end up having long-term, very negative results. And there's a kind of, actually Dr. Latham, I'm not sure where she is in the audience, without my glasses, there she is. She mentioned just in the session before about the barriers that we have inside us and the barriers even within this conference room, and the way, the reticence with which maybe we've interacted with certain, or not necessarily avoided consciously, but maybe subconsciously avoided contact with some of the people in the room who look like they might be different from us, or who maybe have said things that we thought we disagreed with. And the human reflex is conflict avoidance, in the sense that nobody wants to pick a fight unless without a very good reason. But the cumulative effect of this, what I would call politically correct mindset, is that people don't get to hear what you really think. And in fact, I mean, when I think of my relationships with my closest friends and family members, there's a mutual feeling that we could say anything to each other. However critical, I could say, reveal thoughts, however dirty, but I'm not going to be judged. There's a relationship of trust, which means it feels like I can say whatever I want. And then, obviously, in a formal setting, in a more polite setting, there's a deep reluctance to do that because it's not done, because you don't know how it's going to go, because that trust isn't there, because it's not based on any historical or shared experience. I'd love to tell a lot of different stories, but the one that I'm now thinking of, I was lucky enough, and it was a matter of being lucky, to live through the Arab Spring in Egypt, between Cairo and Alexandria, and I was there for about 6 months in 2011, from the beginning right through. I was lucky enough to travel into pretty heavily Muslim Brotherhood and even Salafist neighbourhoods. I was sort of living in one for a while, and interacting with, going into the bakery on the corner, and the Salafist music in the corner, and verses of the Quran all over the shop, and struggling along in Pidgin Arabic at the start, and then as the months went by, getting a little bit better. I realised that, these guys had never ever interacted with a Westerner before, because there just are no Westerners in this particular suburb of Alexandria. There's a few tourists in Cairo, far fewer tourists now, of course, which is the tragic result of the Arab Spring, is that there's even less contact now than there was 5 years ago. But it's not rocket science. If you've never heard anything else, you won't. You will absorb the ideas that are around you to be absorbed. And so every time in your daily lives you kind of make this decision, I won't say that because it's a bit risky. You're in a way contributing on a micro level to the continuation of that situation. This, of course, we're all in favour of respect, but what does that actually mean? I mean, what it can often mean is respecting someone enough, taking them intellectually seriously enough to actually say what you think, which is much easier to do when you share a language, a mother tongue, you share a cultural background, but finding that courage to do it, and then not just courage, but also the skill of doing it in a constructive way, is hard work. I mean, and anyone who thinks that, who's not in favour of dialogue, everyone loves the sound of it, but a lot of the time, dialogue ought to be, if not nasty, at least bare and honest. And I congratulate Barry and Alan, who set the tone, I thought, for this whole conference, for the way that they, with humour, lightened the atmosphere enough in order to try to encourage us to engage in genuinely critical discussions. I think to some extent that's been achieved, although I do sort of share Dr. Latham's frustration a little bit with the slightly politically correct atmosphere of the last 2 or 3 days, but it's also completely understandable. But obviously if the privileged people in this room can't get that right, then there's no hope for people who don't have the kind of access to ideas that everyone in this room has through virtue of their mobility, social background, and so on. So that was the general background on this idea of settling for separation. I mean, there is in a way, the secular model, I think this goes very deep in Anglo-American political philosophy after the Second World War, is, these, what the Germans call Einheitsideologie, and these ideologies of unity, communism and fascism, demonstrably failed. And there's a tremendous skepticism about trying to build some kind of common framework of values, and there was a not unwise, I don't think, movement in political philosophy after the war. I'm thinking of people like Isaiah Berlin, and then a little bit later John Rawls, for those of you who are schooled in this stuff, trying to, how can we build up a value-neutral political architecture in which we can all kind of live, and we all basically leave each other alone to pursue our own, I think in the literature it's called conception of the good life. And I think it was very well intentioned, but I think the history of the last, certainly since the end of the Cold War, has shown us that it's not enough, that model has had its time, and that certainly the people in this room are looking for some kind of, what we've just heard from Kawa Hassan, lacking system of, if not common values, or at least some sort of common identity. And I've been involved for the last 3 years with, many of you will know the work of Hans Küng, the controversial Catholic theologian who's been working on the so-called Global Ethic Project, which started off in a difficult space because it felt as if it had to use the logic of consensus rather than the logic of dialogue. So in other words, how can we build this common framework of unity without alienating 2 billion of the world's Muslims? How can we say to people, you can keep your identity but sign up to this bigger framework, which is beyond Dar al-Islam, or beyond the narrow identity of a sectarian or religious community. And the experience of the last 20 years is that it doesn't really matter how you draw up the common principles that it's got to come from in here. It doesn't. You can, however beautiful a list you draw up, no, people aren't going to identify with that list in the same way. They're not necessarily going to sacrifice for it. And so the challenge theologically, I guess, is finding a way, and this was Küng's great contribution to Catholic theology, was, well, how can I still be a Catholic and take a much more relaxed attitude to the scripture and say, okay, the story of Jesus remains important to me, it still defines my life, I still identify with it, I still believe on some deep level, but I now also accept the possibility that when I meet someone of a different faith, I now accept the possibility not just that their ideas might be compatible with my world, like if you picture sort of overlapping Venn diagrams, not that, but that I can actually learn something from talking to a Muslim or a Hindu or a Confucian that I couldn't have learnt from within my own tradition. And what he tries to affirm is that there is a way of being meaningfully Catholic which not only allows that but requires it, and that in a sense that's what it means to be a Catholic, is to be honest and intellectually open in that way. And it turns out that within all of the major world religions, Hinduism, Islam, Confucianism, Buddhism, Judaism, there is this dialogical principle. Not every school of Islamic theology is open in this way, but there is. If you look in a 1400-year civilization, there's plenty of stuff which is. And so I lead a fairly schizophrenic existence. I spent this semester teaching a course on the Arab world and the Global Ethic Project. Mixture, mainly I teach in Germany, so mainly German students, but a few Erasmus students from other European countries, and 3 or 4 students of a couple of Arab origin, a couple of Turkish origin, and a couple of other students studying Islamic theology. And so in the group, I was trying to convey 2 messages simultaneously. To the Western kids in the group whose main contact with Islam is through TV news reports of jihadi suicide bombings, trying to communicate to them there's a 1400-year-old civilization here which you know nothing about. You don't even know what you don't know about it. And trying to introduce them to the literature of the civilization, in which obviously the Quran is right in the middle. The music of the civilization, the art of the civilization, and so on, saying, look at all the stuff that until now you didn't know existed, and here it is. And then at the same time, taking a couple of the more radical, I would say, at-risk, or what we would use euphemistically the language of at-risk students in the class, potential maybe future Islamic extremists, and saying, oh, hang on a minute, Islam does not have all the answers. It doesn't. And that's a very difficult thing to say in public, as everyone in this room knows. So finding, this is exactly why dialogue can be so hard, because there's no point. I don't know if I take an example, the American presidential elections in the news recently, everyone will have an opinion. Everyone will be in favour of one or the other, or will be saying, no, I'm not voting for either of them. There's not a lot of point reinforcing whatever the person you're talking to's opinion is. Or whoever the most interesting, the most constructive thing to do is to try to make arguments for the other candidate. Right? But we tend not to do that because it's unpredictable. But if the message of, I guess, my living through the Arab Spring and meeting people who were imprisoned, a couple of whom, or no one I knew directly, but friends of friends who were killed in the demonstrations, is that, here we have all of this freedom. Here I can stand here and say pretty much whatever I want. There are people in other parts of the world for whom that's not true, who are willing to struggle and eventually to die for that right, and it's not fair of us to censor ourselves here just because there's a risk that we might lose our jobs or cause an offence to the person sitting next to us. So it's hard to do. It's hard to do in a nice way, but the message I'd leave you with, and I'd like to actually finish a little bit early if I can, just so that there's some time for. I've run out of time already, but hopefully there'll be some time for some questions, and I'll be happy to take them from you. But thank you very much again for having me, and I look forward to hearing from the last 2 speakers. Thank you.